Moving across town? You've got pretty much everything packed up except that couch. What are you going to do with it? It's in perfectly good condition, so it shouldn't just end up on the street. Donate it to St. Vinny's. Your pre-loved goods donated to St. Vinny's thrift stores stay right here in Dane County. Call St. Vinny's at 608-278-2920 extension 1 to schedule your free home pickup today. Want to save some time and money today? Order your next meal from Eat Street. Eat Street was founded right here in Madison and still operates locally. They're focused on local. Most of their orders, 85%, go to family-run restaurants. And now you can earn up to 5% Eat Street cash back only in Madison. Plus, get 15% off your next Madison order with the code CITYCAST. That's one word, not case sensitive, through May.
Today on CityCast Madison. Happy Earth Day, y'all! Today, and every day truly, we celebrate Mother Earth and her beauty. And here in Wisconsin, there's a lot to take in. From the luscious Northwoods, to the trails of Door County, to Madison's lakes and beyond, these beauties have been preserved, and in some cases restored, thanks to the work of environmentalists and the tribal nations of Wisconsin, who have fought for our state's natural environments. To learn more about conservation in Wisconsin, host Bianca Martin sat down with Kurt Miney, Senior Fellow at the Aldo Leopold Foundation. It's Tuesday, April 22nd. I'm executive producer Haley Sperling, and here's what Madison's talking about. Hello, it's executive producer Haley Sperling here. Before we get into the show today, I want to remind you that it's our spring membership campaign. You can join the growing community of passionate Madison residents who support our work and get a free CityCast Madison coffee mug at membership.citycast.fm. Thank you to our CityCast Madison neighbors who make our work possible. And a special shout out to Brandy M, who just became a neighbor. Thank you, Brandy. Okay, now on to the show.
Hi, Kurt. Happy Earth Day.
Well, thank you, Bianca, for inviting me to join you and your whole team down there at CityCast. I'm eager to have a chat with you and to think about our history and think about where we're headed and where we are right now and all that. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Yes, I am so excited. Our natural landscape here in Wisconsin, it's the lifeblood. It's what fuels me. I know it's what fuels you. So let's talk about it here on Earth Day. Many folks probably know that the holiday was created by the Madisonite and former Governor Gaylord Nelson. What they might not know is that our region has played like a huge part in the environmental movement and that we have our own specific legacy in the environmental and conservation space. I'm curious, what about our Wisconsin approach to the outdoor world is different from other states like Massachusetts or California?
Oh, gosh, yeah. Lots of us have asked that question over the generations. Why did Wisconsin emerge as such a unusual leader in movements, over the last century and a half? Well, there are a few kind of answers to that some of us have put forward over the years. I'll just mention a few of them. Well, let's say one of the first is that the state of Wisconsin, became a state and was settled by the European settlers, and where it was very quickly wrecked. It only took a couple generations for basically the entire landscape to go through this period of depletion and destruction, whether it was the cutting of the northern forests in the late 1800s, the loss of prairies to conversion to agriculture over a century, the draining of wetlands, the depletion of wildlife populations, the pollution of our waters, urban and rural, on and on. By the early 20th century, it was such a mess that there was no alternative. We had to start thinking of new ways to live on this land. As Aldo Leopold said, how do we live on the land without spoiling it? The oldest task in human history, he called it. And so the movement had an immediate crisis. It's not unlike where we are now with climate change. Think of it that way. The crises of the day were deforestation and wildlife depletion and soil erosion. And so that's one reason, is because we were kind of historically at that moment when we had to come up with a positive response. There are other reasons. One, we're a state that's still largely rural, despite our larger urban areas. And so there's still connections to the land among even our urban neighbors and friends. You're only a generation or two removed from a rural setting if you're in the city. I could go on and on. There's several other. The role of the University of Wisconsin. Let's talk about that. One of the great hubs of development of the natural sciences, really, in the Western Hemisphere. It's been, especially in the 1800s, geologists, hydrologists, and limnologists, and all the other ologies. Madison in particular, but the entire state university system provided a lot of the scientific input and that philosophy that science serves the public interest, right? The Wisconsin idea. That's a really important part of the reason. And I guess the last one I'll mention, because I could go on for the entire time we have talking about this, but is the presence of our native nations in Wisconsin. Historically, all through history, up to present, whether it's the Ho-Chunk in the south, the Ojibwe communities in the north, the Menominee Nation up in northeast Wisconsin, and the other tribes, the constant presence of the tribes and the reminder that our current population was not here in the same way that Native folks were here for thousands of years. And so that legacy of indigenous knowledge and experience in living on this land has become ever more important as we face the challenges we face right now.
Yeah, and stewarding the land. I want to talk, you've mentioned one of them, Aldo Leopold. I want to talk about some of the major figures in the environmental movement, certainly names that folks close to it and maybe even just general knowledge individuals will know about. Let's dive in, starting with kind of going back to the literal 1800s, John Muir, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's talk about the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He was there.
He was there.
He's really the first big name in environmental history with a connection to our hamlet. So for those who are unfamiliar, what is he known for?
Well, probably most famously, John Muir he's often called the father of the national park system, right? He comes along at a time when we didn't have national parks. We didn't have a national park service. And he was as an activist and advocate especially in the 1890s and early 1900s, he was advocating. But before then, his Wisconsin connections. His family migrated from Scotland and ended up near Portage, Wisconsin. He had 2 farms there. And John Muir grew up in this kind of, isolated European frontier situation. But he was a precocious young guy who his brain was so active and curious and literally inventive. He was known as an inventor. If you walk into the Historical Society building on campus there, turn to the right and go see still John Muir's famous machine for getting up and waking and reading books that he invented as a student.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
He left home to go to the University of Wisconsin if I remember right, 1859, somewhere around there. And spent 2 years at the university, and it really opened him to the larger world and exposed him to the natural sciences of the day, in particular geology. And then he went off to pursue his career in his life. It ended up in California. He was especially associated with Yosemite National Park and began to write. And this is where he really comes into the fore and becomes a public figure. He was a talented writer, very evocative, bringing his readers out into adventures in the wild. So he was representative of that very early wave of environmental concern and looking to protect, that was kind of the key phrase at that point, was protection of land and against this exploitation that he had witnessed as a young person here in Wisconsin.
Yeah, and when we're talking about the 1860s, and you already kind of mentioned it, this moment in Wisconsin's history, I mean, we've got these great, incredible forests that, as you mentioned, like he was witnessing just the deforestation, just like serious industry taking over. Was that the time when Wisconsin really kicked off getting involved in the environmental movement?
Yeah, you can say that the kind of the foundational experience for, again, European settler Wisconsin, not for our native friends who had lived here forever, but for the new settler generations coming to Wisconsin, begins, you go all the way back to the French fur traders and all that, but, with the creation of the state in 1848, very quickly, right after the Civil War, between 1865 and 1900, comes the great wave of deforestation. And basically the entire North Woods, the northern third to a half of Wisconsin, is deforested. First for the pines, later on the hardwood forests, and by the 1920s or 20s, it's almost completely barren. And it's a real crisis. And yet the University of Wisconsin began to respond to this crisis by figuring out how we deal with it. How do we deal with the overexploitation? How do we deal with the aftermath of wrecked landscapes? That would take a couple decades. But nationally, that's when the national movement for forestry, which really was the cutting edge field of its time, because there wasn't even the word conservation even didn't mean what it means now. So this was the very early phases from the 1890s into the 1920s of establishing forestry as part of the progressive era crusade. And again, Wisconsin plays a key role in that, with lots of leadership coming from the university, from others in the state. And that brings you actually to Aldo Leopold.
Let's talk Aldo.
Okay, I could roll on here. So Leopold is actually a Midwestern kid. He was born and raised in Iowa on the Mississippi River. But he goes off. He's got this, again, kind of passionate interest as a boy in wildlife. And he's very aware of this forestry situation we just talked about, because his father, in fact, ran a furniture factory, a successful furniture factory that depended on a steady supply of wood, right? So he was attuned, even as a young teenager. And he went off to study forestry at Yale, enters the brand new U.S. Forest Service, established under President Theodore Roosevelt. But then ends up in Madison in 1924, comes back to the Midwest, to Madison, to work for the U.S. Forest Service here, and then joins the university in 1933 as a professor, the first really professor of wildlife conservation or wildlife management in the country. So Leopold is a child of that era of deforestation and destruction. He kind of rides that first wave of conservation into professional work and becomes very prominent because he's an innovative thinker, particularly in opening up beyond forestry to think about how we deal with these other crises of wildlife depletion, of soil erosion, and on and on. So Leopold, and the last thing I'll say on him for the moment is his real kind of fundamental contribution across all these areas that he made an impact in, where he's bringing this brand new science into the conversation. This new science called ecology that most people had never heard of. It was hardly even a vocabulary word at that point. And Leopold recognized early on that the science of relationships was fundamental to understanding how we sustain our livelihoods and lives on the land.
I'm glad you took it there, because I know you had mentioned the Wisconsin idea, which was that concept was published in 1912, right? So while Aldo Leopold was around. But the idea is that the university is going to serve the whole state. It's an ecological system idea. We hear about it a lot, but it's like we are connected to all of our systems, not just where you are right here. I'm glad that you brought up him bringing, ecology to the fore in this new science, because that was really critical to the work.
Yeah, and he's training the very first, professional graduate students here at the University of Wisconsin. He is very active in what we would now call extension or outreach, right? He's all over the place, and he's working daily with farmers and with hunters and with, everyone in the state. He was really in service to the idea of conservation. And as I once wrote, he became a resource himself for the state of Wisconsin. And through 1948, when he died, he was very involved, not just as a scientist at the university, but as a engaged, really, leader at the state level in every walk of public life.
And folks who are in Madison might know there's a center here, the Aldo Leopold Center, that's located in Monona. Mm-hmm. There's also one in Baraboo, Wisconsin, where his shack is. You know a lot about this, considering you wrote a biography about Aldo Leopold. We want to throw that out there. You're a fellow at the Aldo Leopold Foundation. And, both of those places do so much work today to continue educating folks about all the Leopold's land ethic and the ideas of ecology and how we need to steward the environment.
Yeah, and let's not forget the University Arboretum in Madison, because Leopold was actually the first research director there and helped us. In fact, his appointment at the university in Madison was tied to the creation of the Arboretum. And that's now such an asset, not only for the people in Wisconsin and Madison, but of course it's a university research center too. And it is really the home globally for a whole new field of conservation that emerged through Leopold's work, and that's the field of restoration ecology. The idea that we don't just protect places, we don't just try to manage them sustainably, but we can actively restore their ecological health and diversity. And so the Arboretum has played a fundamentally important role, and that was another key part of Leopold's legacy in Madison.
Yes, your mom wants you to call her. This Mother's Day, give her a call and give her an Aura digital picture frame. My sister lives 2,000 miles away, and I often miss her when I'm out doing something fun that she'd love. I have this photo of us roller skating on the boardwalk by Santa Monica Pier, and every time I see it, I feel the joy of that moment trying to skate and look cool. Aura Frames was named the best digital photo frame by Wirecutter and featured in 495 gift guides last year. So the next time you need to call your mom, you can also send her a new pic of you from that trip you're telling her about right from your phone. Aura has a great deal for Mother's Day. For a limited time, listeners can save on the perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com to get $35 off plus free shipping on their best-selling Carver matte frame. That's auraframes.com, promo code CityCast. Support the show by mentioning us at checkout. Terms and conditions apply.
What sort of promises have you made to yourself this year? Getting in better shape, eating healthier, saving more money, traveling somewhere new? What about discovering a new culture by learning a new language? With Babbel, you can do that in just a few weeks. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I've been learning Spanish with Babbel. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or whatever pace you choose. And because conversing is the key to really understanding each other in new languages, Babbel is designed using practical, real-world conversations. The Spanish I learned on Babbel really helped me on a recent trip to Mexico City, ordering in restaurants, shopping at the textile market, cheering on at the Lucha Libre, and I've been keeping it up since I got home. You're a podcast listener. I know that because you're listening here. I bet you'll love Babbel's new podcasts. On Eavesdrop in Espanol, which I listen to, you get to listen to a real conversation, then have the teacher host explain back to you. Then you listen again and catch everything. And you can even read along in the transcript. It's a really fun and effective way to learn. Let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting CityCast listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/CityCast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/CityCast. Spelled BABBEL.com/CityCast. Babbel.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hey y'all, it's executive producer Haley Sperling here. I want to talk to you about this whole CityCast Madison neighbor thing we're doing. In a time when our news feeds are full of literal AI slop and increasingly tense national rhetoric, you tune into the show because it's local and it's real. Every weekday, we bring you conversations about what matters most right here in Madison from real voices in our community. Our work is about keeping you informed about the things happening in your backyard, along with sharing the joyful moments that make Madison what it is, like the Dane County Farmers Market and the Wisconsin Film Festival. We do what we do because we care about this place, and we hope you do too. If our work is something you value, if you want to make sure that we can keep bringing you this show, please consider becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor. Your support is essential to our work. Plus, there's perks. Becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor also gives you access to the neighbors-only events with the CityCast Madison crew. We actually have one coming up at the end of this month. A brand new thing that we're offering neighbors is the opportunity to shout out a local business or nonprofit you love in the newsletter and on the pod. Plus, if you sign up today, we'll send you a complimentary CityCast Madison coffee mug as a welcome gift. Nice. So, if you believe, like we do, that better neighbors make better cities, join us. Become a CityCast Madison neighbor today at membership.citycast.fm. Again, that's membership.citycast.fm. All right, now back to the show.
You know, folks who regularly listen to the show know that I grew up in Baraboo. So I had this experience of just a really incredible education at a young age about ecology and about preserving the environment with Devil's Lake, but also the Aldo Leopold Center, going to the Shack, and the International Crane Foundation. Just this rich legacy that I didn't necessarily take it for granted, but it was 100%. Like, it was so deeply a part of my childhood experience.
Well,
and shaped who I am. Yeah.
You're a true Badger. I mean, that's kind of what I often say is like, we just kind of absorb this through osmosis if you grow up in Wisconsin. The ethic of conservation that Leopold and, again, our indigenous peoples of Wisconsin have fostered over generations. It just comes, whether you're thinking about it or not, it comes to you through your interactions with your neighbors, but also with the places you live. So yeah, we are. And when you go outside of Wisconsin and you talk to people about all this, it's kind of like you notice the difference.
Yeah. And I did want to just make a note about impacts. I remember the first time I went to California, I was probably 15. It was Northern California out, let's say, by San Francisco Bay, et cetera. I was so proud to learn that Aldo Leopold had a hand in conserving and preserving public lands all the way 2,000 miles away from us, right?
Yeah.
So the impact is everywhere. You know, we started this conversation saying Happy Earth Day. Let's talk about Gaylord Nelson, right?
Gaylord.
Right, because this is something you wrote, that by the 1970s, Wisconsin, quote, stood at the forefront of the emerging environmental movement. Can we talk about our guy, Gaylord Nelson? And, you know, he's a former governor and senator, created Earth Day. Like, he was so involved in environmental legislation, right?
Oh, fundamentally. He was, I think most people would agree, the most important political leader in environmental policy through the mid 20th century, and was at the very, very heart, as you said, the epicenter of Earth Day and what came out of Earth Day, and when he was still in the Senate, of course, for another decade. Oh, Gaylord, anyone who knew Gaylord could talk about him forever, and we always smile because he was deadly serious when it came to his work, especially on environmental issues, but he was also a leader in areas like civil rights and education and other fields. But of course, his most important, or at least best known legacy, is as an environmental leader. So he's deadly serious when it came to making progress. But he was also a very funny guy and knew how to balance his serious side with his lighthearted side. And anyone who ever heard him, and I'm laughing right now because I saw this many times, he would make you laugh when he was giving a speech before he drilled down to his serious message. And that was one reason he was so effective. So he grows up in northwest Wisconsin in the little town of Clear Lake, Wisconsin. How appropriate, right? And he goes on to this political career after serving in World War II. I think, you know, what's the connection here is he was the embodiment of this kind of general cultural commitment to conservation that Wisconsin had. I mean, he, again, sort of absorbed it maybe consciously, but a lot unconsciously. And when he became a prominent political leader in the state, he worked in a bipartisan way. And this is really important when we think of where we are now. But back then, concern about environmental issues and the desire to make progress in the legislative arena, it was broadly shared across the political spectrum. And Gaylord worked closely with many people who were not even in his own party to make that progress. And he would do the same nationally. When he started Earth Day, he actually brought in a Republican congressman from the House of Representatives to be the co-chair. You know, that was the way he operated. And he lived on, and I got to know him pretty well, actually, in his later years. And it's one of my most treasured kind of, I don't know, things that have come out of the work I've done is having a chance to to get to know people like Gaylord Nelson. And then just to get to the point, though, on Earth Day, that was really, he consciously said, we need a movement here. If we're going to move the ball in the Congress, we need to show that the American people are concerned. So 20 million people coming out on April 1970. And I was one of them. I was just a young kid in grade school. I remember distinctly going out to pick up litter off the playground lot and plant some trees. And yeah, I was a very young kid. And
that's awesome.
It left the impression on me.
Yeah, I knew that he had created Earth Day, but some other things was just like, yeah, he was a senator for 18 years for our state, a U.S. senator. He also authored legislation to create the National Hiking Trail System, including like the 2,100-mile Appalachian Trail System. No big deal. He had key pieces of environmental legislation, including the Wilderness Act,
Wild and Scenic Rivers, Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act. I mean, it was a period of incredible innovation in national policy. But to be very blunt and open about it, these are in the news right now because we are seeing a reaction to that wave of legislation that, again, most of us alive now have been the beneficiaries of.
Right. And we're seeing protests and demonstrations across the country in national parks and the national parks funding being slashed for sure. We won't go too deep into it because I know we're talking history. But while we're talking history, fascinating as it is, a Republican president, Richard Nixon, was one of the most prolific presidents when it comes to having an impact in these at that era in terms of signing into law a lot of bedrock environmental legislation.
Absolutely right. That the Republican leadership, not to again dwell on the partisan aspects of all this, but it was fundamental. And here in Wisconsin, I'll just mention one example of this too. We have what's called the Knowles-Nelson Stewardship Fund, which was a bipartisan fund for protecting and acquiring and protecting public lands for the people of Wisconsin, named after Governor Nelson and Governor Knowles, the Republican.
Mm-hmm.
And it enjoyed bipartisan support and is actually in the news. You'll see it in the headlines probably in the next few weeks because it's another one of those issues that are being debated again right now.
Hey, CityCast. According to me and my calculator, you will spend more time this week between the sheets than you will at work. So upgrade your sheets to Cozy Earth. Luxury starts where you rest. I start my evening in buttery soft Cozy Earth bamboo pajamas. Then I dip into a Cozy Earth bamboo sheet set. They are silky and temperature regulating. Forget the 9 to 5. Prioritize your 5 to 9. Cozy Earth products will transform those hours into a sanctuary. And they take comfort seriously with a 100-night sleep trial and a 10-year warranty. Luxury should not be out of reach, so Cozy Earth is giving CityCast listeners 40% off their best-selling sheets, towels, pajamas, and more. Visit CozyEarth.com and use the code CozyMadison for 40% off because you deserve a great night's sleep, and sanctuary awaits at Cozy Earth.
Hey, it's your host, Bianca, popping in to tell you about our new CityCast Madison Neighbors program. I know you've heard us talk about membership before, and many of you are already part of it. Well, it's got a new name. We're calling it CityCast Madison Neighbors because we've learned that people who support CityCast Madison are people who care deeply about the city and want to make it better. They're just the kind of neighbors this city needs. We're also adding benefits. CityCast Madison neighbors still have access to ad-free podcast listening and an exclusive weekly local events preview. But now you also get regular events like happy hours with other CityCast Madison neighbors, local volunteering meetups, and other members-only events where we explore and better our city together. And you get to shout out a local business or nonprofit you love on the show and in the Madison Minutes newsletter. For $10 a month, you can become a CityCast Madison neighbor today by going to membership.citycast.fm. That's membership.citycast.fm. We couldn't make the show without people like you supporting it, and we're so excited for you to be a part of it. Thanks a million. You've alluded to this a number of times in the conversation, and I knew we were going to get to it. We talked about three really well-known names in environmental history, but there are unsung heroes talking about, the contributions of our indigenous peoples here on the land, In Madison, their environmental impact certainly goes, so far back. This land we live on is the ancestral land of Ho-Chunk Nation, and there are the Ojibwe nations up north protecting and advocating for their land protections to this day, fighting tooth and nail. So can you talk about that a bit, like how indigenous knowledge has impacted environmentalism in our state and here, locally?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, I offer these comments not as a Native person myself. That's very important to say. But I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of the tribes in Wisconsin for many years in many cases. So, yeah, the Ho-Chunk Nation, its presence in Madison, in Dejob, the Four Lakes, has been there since long before Europeans arrived and endures and is being expressed in more in the last 10 years than it ever was when I was younger and in going to school in Madison and all that. I'll mention just very locally, since you have Baraboo roots, Bianca, between Baraboo and Madison, there used to be this great big military facility called the Badger Army Ammunition Plant, right?
Yep. You drive by it.
You know it.
All the time.
Right next to
Great place to go birding now.
It is. And it's right next to Dewakanchunk, which most people know as Devil's Lake, but Spirit Lake. The Ho-Chunk Nation was able to reclaim a portion of the Badger lands, but that is now known as Mawakanchunk Land, Spirit Lake. That's the name that the tribe chose to give to their piece of land. So here in southern Wisconsin, and that's just one example of the many places, the Kickapoo Reserve is another great example. Or right on campus in Madison and around the city, protecting effigy mounds. Up north, the Ojibwe communities up north, whether it's restoring wild rice beds, or protecting their waterways, or arguing for different policies on wolves and other wildlife. They played a key role, increasingly important. And just last week, I'll mention one name in particular, because I had a chance to talk with Mike Wiggins last week. Mike was the chair of the Bad River Band when they were having to ward off the proposed Pinocchio mine, a really important struggle up north. And so we've seen the leadership of the tribes, especially in the last 15, 20 years. Not that it wasn't there before, it's just the issues have come at us fast and furious. To me, the most powerful thing about this is we see kind of a converging of people and concern and interest from very different backgrounds. But I want to make a kind of a broader point, Bianca, because that's where you started, is we think of these great leaders, these figures, Leopold and John Muir and Gaylord Nelson, and they accomplished great things, but they could not have accomplished anything without the communities they represented and the communities they worked with. Earth Day was participatory. It was not people in the Capitol in Madison or in Washington saying what to do. It was 20 million people coming out. Another piece of our Wisconsin landscape I'll briefly mention is out near La Crosse, a place called Coon Valley, watershed of Coon Creek. Why is this important? Globally known. Why? Because it was the first place anywhere in the world, at least as far as I know, where all the farmers within this one watershed that had been badly degraded by soil erosion came together and said, to solve this problem, we have to work together as a whole community. So 400 or 500 farmers came together to help solve that problem, to heal that damaged watershed. And I'll be out there in a few weeks, and it's a great example of the fact that progress comes, we need the laws, we need the leaders, but we also need engaged communities, and that's part of the Wisconsin tradition. That is what Earth Day stood for, was participation and engagement.
People power, man.
Absolutely.
People power. So, Kurt, this has been such a good conversation. I want to ask, before we let you go, Madison really has had these figures and these people and the community that put us at the forefront of the environmental movement, as we've laid out. Do you think we still are there? And if not, how can we get back on track?
Oh, boy. That would take a whole nother segment maybe to talk through adequately. Bianca, we have lost ground in some ways. We face a whole nother suite of issues that we didn't face in the same way a generation or two ago. Climate change, biodiversity loss, on and on. We understand more than ever that we can't solve our conservation or environmental problems without also addressing the social dimensions of those issues. So it's a much more complex and complicated space we live in. The politics have obviously changed a lot. I hope we can get back to that place where the shared values of our concern for our landscapes, for future generations, for all species and all people. That's a legacy of Gaylord Nelson, too, who said as much on the first Earth Day, that these issues aren't just about the scenic value of the land or even the plants and animals. It's fundamentally about fairness and about respect. So those kind of shared values, we have to find a way to get back to. Now, if you could see me on my screen, you see my hair is rather gray now. So it's really, Bianca, your cohort, your generation, and the next generations that have to decide if they want to put a little more time, energy, and effort into making change happen. And that is the legacy of Wisconsin. We could have sat back and said, well, too bad the northern forests are gone. We could have sat back and said, too bad those white-tailed deer are almost extinct in Wisconsin. Hard to imagine now. We could have said, too bad the Milwaukee River is a mess and polluted. We could have said, shucks, too bad that, on and on. But no, people stepped up, people from every walk of life and all stations and all backgrounds, talents, occupations, whatever. So it's part of living as a decent citizen and a decent ancestor, as some of my colleagues would like to say. And that was another kind of phrase that came out of a colleague in Wisconsin, Dr. Hugh Iltis, who says, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? So now that's the question before us. We're all going to be leaving legacies for those who follow us. So let's step it up. Let's take advantage of Earth Day and realize that Earth Day was a reflection of what John Lewis called good trouble, right? Making good trouble. So let's make good trouble going forward.
That's a great place to leave it, Kurt. Thank you so much for coming on and bringing us all of this legacy and also leaving us with some good questions.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Bianca, to you and your whole team for inviting me on and for highlighting Earth Day.
That was host Bianca Martin speaking with Kurt Miney, Senior Fellow with the Aldo Leopold Foundation. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm executive producer Haley Sperling. If you enjoyed the show, why not share this episode with someone who cares about our planet? We'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, don't forget to check out the CityCast Madison Neighbors program and join us today at membership.citycast.fm. Again, that's membership.citycast.fm. See ya!